Hi, my name is Andy Kirk, and welcome to Season 1 of Explore Explain. This is a podcast and video series all about data visualization design. In each episode, I have conversations with designers and developers to explore in depth the hidden thinking behind their visualization projects. I'll be asking them to explain the what, the why, and the how of their design process. We have some great guests, some wonderful projects to learn about, so let's jump straight into today's episode.
So in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Dottle. Rachel, thank you ever so much for joining me today. Can you, for the benefit of the listeners and viewers, just give a short introduction, who you are, where you work, and your background, please?
Of course, and thank you for having me. I'm a data visualization designer and journalist. I have previously worked at 538 as a visual journalist on the graphics team, and I'm currently a freelance journalist, and I work at IBM on a data science team as a visualization designer.
Perfect. And today we're going to talk about one of your projects that you worked on in July 2018, which is during the World Cup. And it's a project titled How France and Croatia Made It to the World Cup Final in One Chart. So to begin with, for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, can you just give a quick overview about what this project is, especially for those who can't see it?
Sure. So 538 during the World Cup in 2018 had a predictions page. So we predicted and created kind of this forecast for who was going to win the World Cup overall, as well as each match. So using a combination of kind of ratings and the expected goals, we would have kind of predictions for each match. And as all of the kind of knockout stage matches were being played, we had tracked all of those and wanted to kind of visualize the path or what was happening leading up to the final game. So this kind of graphic is a static visualization of all of the match in-game probabilities leading up to France and Croatia being in the final.
The very nature of 538 is very much about sort of statistical probabilities of politics, sport, maybe the economy. So this feels like a kind of classic 538 product, and it's not the first World Cup that 538 has worked on. But can you talk about how this kind of piece of work, this kind of project, emerges? What's the kind of editorial meetings that you have that say, right, we will plan something like this, and who's involved in that?
Sure. So actually, this piece itself was not planned. It was a bit spontaneous, but obviously it was built on all of the really planned work that we had spent months kind of developing. So again, like I said, we had a predictions page, which has all these in-match probabilities. We had a bracket, which people could fill out before the World Cup even began, based on our probabilities, and kind of like play around with how the simulations would change if a certain team advanced. And that bracket actually lived on the same page as our predictions. So we had built a lot of content around the World Cup. But we kind of... So this piece itself happened in one day. It was just a quick turnaround, and we had a few days of kind of break between the semifinal and the final. And I was talking with my editor at the time, Richie, who was the graphics editor, Richie King, and we were trying to think of a way to kind of get a narrative out of the World Cup, because the World Cup is such an exciting short-term thing that's happening across for the whole world, and there's a really strong narrative in like who's winning, what upsets were there, how do you feel that this excitement going on. So this piece came out of the pieces that we had already built, but it was a spontaneous kind of how can we convey this narrative in like an exciting way with what we have in one day.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well. A couple of things there. First of all, the other products that are part of this overall World Cup package are very much about a sort of live sense of who might win this thing and what's the likelihood of that. And I guess this is a chance at this stage in the World Cup fixtures to look backwards to say, how did this come about? Were the expectations in line with what actually happened? So that's kind of an interesting sort of pivot at that point. And I guess just talking about timescales, although you can plan for the World Cup because you know when it's going to come, and it's 4 years. There's also a sense that, as you said, this was quite a spontaneous piece. The underlying methods, which we'll talk about later on with regards to the area charts that plot the stories of each match, were kind of a constant product. But obviously, something triggered a need for this. What would you say was the moment when you thought, right, this is the thing that we need to do today?
I remember the Slack conversation I was having with Richie. So he had suggested kind of a look back, and we were trying to think of like maybe a timeline or something. And I was staring at these area charts, and I was just like, they kind of look like our brackets where you have, slowly lowering probabilities, such as the March Madness brackets that 538 had been making for multiple years. And I was thinking about how we could create a storyline, and so I sketched out this kind of idea, and I sent it to him, and it was funny because he just wasn't on that page at the time, and I really liked his reaction. It was just like, oh wow, this wasn't what I was thinking at all. So that was kind of fun, and that's why I remember that, because it was just like, oh, look what we kind of figured out.
So. In terms of the kind of the stakeholders involved, yourself as the creator of this, Richie as the I guess the sign-off guy for this, any other people who had an input, a stake? Do you run things past others to see if things are are working for them as well as yourself?
Yeah. I mean, 538's graphic team is really was really pretty small at the time. So it was me, Gus Wezerick, Ella Kuzi, and Julia Wolf, and actually all of them had kind of a involvement in this product, along with kind of the mastermind behind the entire World Cup package, which would be Jay Boyce, who is a computational journalist at 538. And he is kind of the one involved in a lot of the modeling, the back end of all of the predictions. But so Julia Wolf actually contributed to the area charts on the predictions page. So she and Jay Boyce were working on the predictions in the area chart format. Gus and I had been working on World Cup content since November of the previous year. So we had been talking about how to kind of visualize the World Cup for months. And Ella was always my visual edit wizard mastermind, so I would always send sketches to her to kind of get her, because she is such a great visual editor. So I felt like this was a really collaborative piece, like most of my pieces at 538. I think that everybody there was able to kind of input on how this was going to look, and that's really helpful for me. And that goes to also for the editors at 538, both the kind of visual editors and the kind of editorial editors.
Yeah, I think that collaborative spirit comes across because all 538 work has a certain visual identity that you can recognize, and that doesn't just come about as a consequence of guidelines of color usage and typeface. It's something that has to come about through this kind of cross-fertilization of not just ideas but kind of shared editing responsibilities of each other work, and I think that is very, very apparent in all 538 pieces. Just going back briefly to the timescales, so obviously this was launched on the 11th of July, which was the day that the second semi-final took place when England lost to Croatia. I guess at that point there was an urgency to get this out before, obviously, the Sunday final. And I guess in the context of an organisation like 538, you probably want to get it out there before everything else is also talking about the same thing. Is that fair?
Yeah. I remember this actually published in the evening. It published at 5 p.m. on that same day because we had been watching the match. The little area charts finished, and then I can't remember exactly if we had the idea already the day before or if the idea came about on the same day. But I just remember the benefit of the area charts and using those to kind of build off of the work that had already been done is I didn't actually have to run any code. This is a static piece. The area charts were built in D3 on the page. I just kind of SVG grabbed them and put them in Illustrator and just started going to work. So It didn't actually take a whole lot of time. The editing, obviously, and putting the photos and kind of working on the annotations and what it's actually going to say and is it actually a narrative. But the building of it, I think, was pretty quick, which was good because we had no time and we wanted it to be able to live on the internet for a while before it expires. Obviously,
Right.
once the final match starts playing, this doesn't really matter anymore because, you know.
It's been and gone. Yeah.
Yeah.
With regards to the other people aspect of all this, which is of course the audience, I mean, I would imagine there's probably quite a fairly established characteristic of a 538 reader. Does that change when it comes to a topic like sport and perhaps specifically about football, or is your thought process around the same kind of cohort of people who will access this kind of thing?
I think I was really hoping that this would go beyond the regular 538 reader. I think 538 has a really loyal audience of kind of people at the intersection of politics and sports, and people who already have an understanding of statistics or understanding of how probabilities and predictions work and are obsessively updating their page to look at the match predictions and how that changes the rankings. But the World Cup is kind of accessible to a lot of people because, you know, you don't have to know anything about football before watching the World Cup because you can, you know, choose a country, your country, any country to support, and you can watch all the way through and you get to feel the excitement without having to have some knowledge of which league teams are ranked where. The World Cup is its own little world that you can be a part of for a month. And so I think what I was hoping was that those people who had gotten interested in the World Cup, especially being in the United States when the US wasn't even in it, but people could kind of get involved. I was hoping that this would kind of encapsulate that life that they had lived for the past 3.5 weeks and, you know, feel it and go beyond kind of just the people who look at 538 for the predictions.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the idea as well that a piece like this could reach out to an audience that isn't a typical 538 reader because, you know, as you said, this is a global event. There are millions and millions of people consuming everything about football. And so this, you know, if this is a hook that brings people over from that world into 538 as well, you know, fantastic. You said that you started planning around November time, and I'm kind of fascinated by the prospects of a regular scheduled event that everybody will be visualizing. Because on one hand, there's the benefit of it being known when it's going to take place, and you can pretty much get a sense of the data that will be available and the kind of interesting stories that might exist, but you know that everyone else is doing something similar. And there has to be some notional competitiveness in all this. So when you are planning, are you consciously looking to find innovative and novel ways to stand out from the crowd of visualizing data? And do you try to look back over previous similar approaches to find ways that you might want to emulate other methods that have been successful, but also to avoid things that might just be what everyone else is doing as well?
Yeah, definitely. So we started talking about the World Cup, I think, as early as maybe October or November 2017. And I remember that we had a lot of conversations about what 538 had done in 2014 and what worked about it and what didn't. And I think 538 also has kind of a unique position because they've been doing so many predictions on sports that have like a full page and a ranking table. And so there's an established like way that we knew we were going to have to kind of visualize the World Cup to begin with because that's what 538 does. And so we had an idea of like what things were going to happen, but we wanted to think of ways to kind of go beyond that or to kind of expand that work. So one thing that we had added to the World Cup that we hadn't had in 2014 was a bracket, an interactive bracket that you could kind of update the simulations and see how things would change. So that was actually a big piece that we had been working on. So I was thinking a lot about brackets to begin with, trying to think of a way to make a bracket look not like every other sports bracket, which is really hard because, you know, there's only so much you can do with a bracket. And so I was actually feeling a bit disappointed, to be honest, at the end of April and May when we were coming together trying to work on this bracket, and there were so many limitations to what you can add to it. And then I think that this piece actually was like I don't know what the word is, but it was like I felt immediately better about my whole bracket experience because I felt like I had made something where I was like, oh, this tells a story. It's obviously not an interactive bracket. It's not, it gets the bracket, but it does something completely different from what I had seen. So I was excited about that. But we did look a lot at what other places had been doing for sports kind of tournaments. The basketball March Madness influences a lot of what we're doing because it's a similar tournament kind of encapsulated in one kind of month-long event. So the stuff that 538 had done for March Madness, including those live matches and the updating probability of a team winning, that was something that we influenced the work we were doing for the World Cup, obviously.
And I think there's something perhaps in American sports, there is something perhaps more established about the notion of a bracket and sports bracket. So I guess you can learn from what other bracket approaches have been used over there, but also for, I would say perhaps certainly over in the UK, brackets are perhaps less commonplace. For us it's all about tables, league tables and things like that. So there's still a more novel approach that we see in these kind of bracket architectures. Moving on to the data. So obviously, as you said, this was something that was in effect building on charts that had been generated already. So the kind of gathering of the data for this particular project in and of itself wasn't perhaps, I would imagine, heavy loaded with data gathering, but can you just speak to the broader data collection analysis that fed these charts in the first place? Because these were charts that were providing live data during the event of the match, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I'm not the expert to speak about the way that the predictions are created, but there's actually a really amazing piece that Jay Boyce wrote about the way that the model works, the way that all of the live in-match predictions work. But basically taking the ratings, the SPI ratings, and kind of some other adjustments. The point of the in-match predictions is the expected goals for each team given the current situation. And so it's the likelihood of a team winning based on the current status of the game. And unlike the knockout stage, I think what makes it easier for these charts is there's no tie. So there's no draw, so obviously it makes a sweeter picture, basically. But you can see that the other matches, there's also a likelihood of a draw, so you can see kind of the way that we added that to the information. But yeah, the data is all coming in from the main predictions page and the ratings and the expected goals. And I won't try and explain it any more than that because I feel like Jay has got it all written down, and I can provide you with that link to kind of expand this and make it clearer because I don't want to embarrass myself. But
there's probably a PhD paper behind the science of that, I would imagine, anyway. But yeah, and I mean, one of the things I'm always looking to do early in my analysis to get a sense of the shape of data. So how many things have we got? We've got, I mean, across the entirety of the World Cup, we've got 32 teams. I think there's 63 matches from memory. You've got a range of goals scored. I think in this case, I think it went from 0 to 6 goals.
Yeah.
You've got win probabilities, which are kind of fixed on a 0 to 100%. I would imagine the most annoying thing is extra time. So matches that are tied at 90 minutes going to a 30-minute extra time, which then creates an expanded chart length in theory, or you have to truncate it into the standard. And we'll come on to the spatial questions later on. So these are kind of dimensions that we always have to sort of make sense of. I also noticed, and I would imagine this was a painful thing, Switzerland as a word due to the length of the characters. Yeah, one of the first things I do is do a len function on all my words on my label to see which is the longest, because yeah, that's very, very annoying to handle. When it comes to the kind of editorial perspectives of what these, if we think that a chart answers a question, the question that these charts answer is what's the likelihood of which team winning this particular match.
Yep.
Were there any other potential slices of analysis that you would have done with this work, or was it always going to be this tracking of a likelihood of a team winning a match?
I think it's kind of hard because this was such a quick turnaround. I didn't spend that much time thinking about like alternatives because I just didn't have the time. And the limitations were I wanted something that I could work on in a couple hours. I had to work with what I had already because we didn't have time to generate any new analysis,
Right.
Which I remember talking about with Richie, kind of like how can we make some sort of timeline or overview of what's happened. Like, do we want to look at certain players or cards that were given out? Or, I think the Guardian tracked the goals by player. Like, they had a golden boot tracker. And I think I was coming up with kind of ideas about how to, like, summarize what had happened so far before the final. But to be honest, I think that I was just looking at these area charts and kind of staring at them and thinking, like, we already have a story here, and I don't have time to do all this extra work, and obviously the editors need time to look at it before it can be published, so I need to make space for the process. So I felt very like constrained to kind of like use these area charts, and not in a bad way. I think that ended up making it kind of what it is right now, which is a kind of a strong story, and I think it feels very emotional to me.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a recurring theme that I find in a lot of these conversations, that deadlines, constraints become helpful. The temptation would have been, I would imagine, to add captions about goals that were scored, red cards that were issued, little milestones within the match. And you have the data, or it's accessible, but just because you have it doesn't mean to say you use it. So I think, having that almost avoiding that sense of creep, I think is very useful, and I think it enriches this piece in particular. Obviously, the kind of frame of the analysis that we see is just the knockout stages. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me just the decision there for not including the group? The group stages before that.
I think a bit of it came out of my experience making and working with Jay and the rest of the team on the bracket itself, where we were creating the predictions, and I think that we had such a hard time figuring out how that was going to work. And I mean, Jay was great about it, but I think that knowing that would exponentially complicate the work that had to be done, understanding like where everyone's going to go on the bracket and how it would actually work spatially. I think it was pretty easy decision to be like, let's just do the knockout stage. Like, let's not overcomplicate our life. I think that there are a lot of decisions here that had to be made that had consequences, good or not so good. But I think that one was a pretty easy one for me to make, because I think that there's only so much space on the page. This wasn't going to be something you can zoom into or interactive. This is all static. So yeah, that was an easy decision.
And moving on to the sort of design discussion then. So obviously we've spoken before about the area charts as the representation method for across a full match. What's the likelihood of each team progressing? Was it always an area chart, stacked area chart, should I say? Was it always that method, or were there any other things that you tried out, played with, sketched?
Actually, so for our World Cup predictions page, building off of the March Madness work that 538 had, they were actually line charts.
Right.
But the interesting thing about football is that you can have a draw, and it's probably likely. So the tricky thing there would be if you have a line chart and there's 3 lines, it gets a little complicated and confusing for someone looking at it. But then when you make it an area chart, suddenly you understand that everything adds up to 100% probability, and you can see how the draw takes a certain percentage of that in terms of the likelihood that it's going to happen. So I think that the area chart decision came out of that, trying to make it simpler to convey this fact that football can go, 3 ways, basically.
And I guess the other expanded representation method is the joins that take the winning team to the next round, effectively. And I think that's almost the visual flourish that creates such a unique, connected overall piece. Did you explore different ideas of how that connection from one chart, match chart, to the next round might have played out? Was it always just this sense of a geometric join to the next stack of the starting point of the next chart?
Actually, it wasn't always like that. I think that's a bit controversial because those, those joins, the space that they take up, it's kind of arbitrary because, it depends how spaced out those kind of matches are. And, there's no data behind that space. And sometimes they have to get longer as the bracket is getting, narrower into the middle. So I remember at first I think I used just kind of sort of arrows at one point, which I really hated. And at another point I turned the opacity really down so that you didn't emphasize those kind of joins because, again, they're not really data driven. They're just trying to make the flow connected. But I think I stood by them because it really is powerful in my mind. And I think that it was a balance between being very specific about the information being conveyed and then being a bit more narrative and making this decision to kind of tell the story in a clearer way, even if it's a little less precise, maybe.
Yeah, and I don't know, I think there's something nice. You're absolutely right. The sheer layout of the bracket itself means that these lines in their height at any given point are not necessarily representative of data. But when they do join to the 0 point, the 0 minute mark of the next chart, they do then sort of jump back into representation. I think there's just something nice and cohesive about how you can then track the colours of the team. I think that works really well. You've said that this is a static chart. Were you ever tempted to make this remotely interactive? And what would that have been if you did?
Yeah, if only I had time, I definitely would have. And actually, there was some discussion about turning this into a piece of the Women's World Cup in 2019 in terms of the predictions page. But I think a lot of things took over time that could have gone into making something like this for the Women's World Cup. But I also wonder how much interaction really is necessary for this piece because, interaction is great, but it doesn't always have to add, it doesn't always add stuff that's necessary. And I think that looking back, I probably would have been tempted to add interaction just for interaction's sake. But I like that this was, again, constrained by all of the time and the process. So it lives as kind of a static piece that I think is almost like a poster feeling. And I like that. So I'm glad that I didn't have the time to make it interactive.
That's right, yeah. And I guess on that note, moving on to the discussion about annotation, which is, something that 538 in general does very, very well. So we're talking about labelling and we're talking about headings and just general reader assistance. Obviously, you've picked out a few headline match moments. Was that, I'm not going to say that was random, but what was the kind of the rationale for which highlights you would add to the stories?
Well, there was an element of randomness in that I wanted to fill out space in the bracket where there was a lot of white space. I definitely took advantage of that white space and tried to, add a little bit of text because this piece actually didn't have much text going along with it. So it only gets published with about a paragraph of just explainer. So I wanted to include some kind of annotations. And so a little bit of what it was things I remembered. Some of it was there's a white space here that I can fill. And I think what was exciting was obviously I was paying close attention to the World Cup as it was happening. So I got a bit of a chance to convey the things that I, had noticed or things that I thought were exciting in the white space I had available.
Right. And also, I guess the extended part of that is the use of photo imagery to, again, I would imagine on the same theme to occupy some space to enrich the emptiness of the layout. But again, what was the thinking behind the photos and the players that you picked in this case?
I love the photos. So a bit of it was, again, things that stood out to me or characters in the World Cup that I felt like deserved a bit of attention, or things, pieces that, again, I kind of was constrained by the space. Obviously, I couldn't have put a figure in the Japan-Belgium kind of match. There was no space, and I had a lot of space for the final and the third place match. But I was inspired by, again, my coworkers at 538. Gus Wezerick, for example, he is a great designer, and he included a lot of photos in some of his other pieces. And I think we included a lot of photos in the World Cup quiz that we had created in December when the draw took place and the groups were decided. So I wanted to continue with that, and I'm a bit of an amateur at Photoshop, so it was exciting for me to kind of like incorporate a bit of that and, spend some time looking at photos from the kind of player profiles in Getty Images. So my favorite moment is Neymar, obviously. His little cheeky shoulder peak is just
little
hilarious.
Zoolander stance.
Yeah. And it's so appropriate for his character that it's my favorite moment.
One of the questions I often ask myself is when is too much annotation too much, and when is it too little? So at what point do you decide that, let's say, every chart panel, certainly on the outside, needs the 100 and 0 scale markers, and also the half extra penalty kicks? What's the sort of thinking that you go through when you decide what to include, what not to include?
Sure. So 538 is kind of prides itself on being really accurate and a kind of very specific and explaining everything so that everything is clear, and that's why there's so many methodology pieces about every predictions page that comes out, or any model that's being used needs to be explained, and that bleeds into or kind of influences the visuals too. 538's kind of ethos is to make sure that everything is really clearly understood, and you don't want anything to be kind of ambiguous. So I think one of the kind of things that I was worried about is this inverted match time. So that, and again, the fact that the extra time is not given more space, but it is kind of truncated or kind of made to fit the size of the match. So I wanted to be extra clear, especially if you're looking at this and kind of start zooming in because you want to look closer. You don't want to have to scroll around and be confused about what you're looking at. And so I tried to be extra clear about all of the annotations. Round of 16 is on every piece. The quarterfinal is mostly on it, and the semifinal description is on each of them. The extra time I was really worried about, and that was something we had kind of talked about in the area charts on the predictions page as well. I think that was something that was kind of a tricky decision to make, but to fit the page and to make everything feel aesthetically kind of even, that decision was made. And I wanted to be clear that because these games kind of go back and forth, not all of them have extra time. I wanted to make sure that those that had extra time were labeled.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think it is needed in this case, as you said, not just because of the left to right or right to left sequencing, but I think in particular the orientation within a match. Where are you? And the grid lines do that as well, of course, but I think it's important. The two more annotated features to mention. First of all, I love 538 arrows. I think they're best in class. So I'm just going to leave that there. But secondly, the labelling of the countries, I noticed there's a method whereby you label the country at the last occasion it takes part-ish. Is that the criteria? Is that correct?
For the most part, I think those labels were a matter of space, not as having any rule about where they were supposed to go. I think that I kind of did it on instinct, a little bit less than deciding, this is, so I'll say it was arbitrary. It was kind of where do I have space to put these labels?
Yeah.
You can see, for example, Croatia is labeled twice, I think because I wanted to make sure it was clear that Croatia has a longer path. Same with France. It starts getting longer, so you don't want to look back and forth, where did they come from? So I labeled those twice. And then the Mexico label is so tiny, and because there's so little space, and obviously that's Switzerland issue.
Yes.
Same with Colombia, where it doesn't all fall on the yellow because the way that the shape, that was a really painful decision for me as a designer.
I can imagine, yeah. And And on the note of colours, so obviously the beauty of this topic is that the colours come packaged up already. Did you have to make any tweaks there? I'm particularly thinking yellow and white is always a difficult combination, but I guess the Swedish Columbia yellows are quite vivid. The Brazil one perhaps is the most problematic, but was it a case of lifting the exact hues from the team strips?
So actually, we had a lot of back and forth about this, and especially with Jay when we were first working on the predictions page itself. We wanted to stay true to the colors of the country or the country flag, but the problem is that there are so few colors used in country flags or in jerseys or in whatever. They repeat so many times that we had to kind of, I think within the as the World Cup was playing out, a couple times Jay had to go in and kind of adjust the color on the match because they were too similar. So we stayed somewhat true, and then we would adjust when we noticed that there was not enough contrast.
Right.
And for this, I know I adjusted a few of them because the colors were, blue, red, and yellow, and those were the colors. And I think that was getting really old for me, and it's hard to see contrast and see the power of the path if everything is the same color. So I know that I made some kind of decisions about colors to change to make the most impact. For example, I think the Spain and Russia using the blue, just to make it more contrasty. And I had to make decisions based on which teams were going forward.
Right.
So England, for example, going forward and thinking about what color to use when it comes and hits against Croatia, and same with Belgium, with France. I wanted to make sure that those colors were contrasting enough. And I think the decisions I made were not always true to what color the team uses, but some of them had to be.
Yeah, and I think the idea of let's start off with the idea of using the colour and then there's a trade-off at some point is the most logical heuristic to use. And obviously when you've got problematic colours like England being in white and inevitably you've got a white background for most works, then that's a challenge. We've spoken about the layout of the bracket as the kind of architecture of the whole piece, and we've spoken about the match time left to right on the left, the match time right to left on the right. One thing we've not spoken about is the mobile equivalent layout, and on mobile there's obviously a narrower space to work in. Can you just talk about how you modified the version of this for mobile, and is it a 538 house style that the desktop version is the best version and then the mobile is the compromise? Is that kind of how you reconcile those things?
No, I think so. I feel mixed emotions about the mobile version. I think that it came out of necessity. I did the desktop version first because I had this kind of idea of what it would look like, and then, in the last hour or so before I had to send it to the editors, I had to make a mobile version. And the mobile version to me is very painful. Not in general, but in this piece, because this piece lives so horizontally that I struggled a lot with how to make it a mobile version. And I think the mobile version loses a lot of kind of the excitement of the piece because the mobile version is detached. So I took the little sections from each of the kind of groupings, and separated them out so you can scroll vertically and then you get to the final. And I don't like the mobile version. I think it loses a lot, and I think if I had redone it, I would try to think of another way, but I still think it's really hard to think of another way to do this. And for example, our bracket in the predictions, or the 538's bracket in the predictions page for the World Cup, doesn't exist in mobile. We just didn't create a mobile version. So if you go to the mobile page at that time, you wouldn't see the bracket, you would just see the table. And that decision is made because it's a horizontal kind of experience.
Yeah.
And I thought of, rotating this, but then the issue that comes into it is you only see one section first, and then you have to scroll down to get the rest of that rest of the, side of the bracket is equally as important, but you don't get that experience if you're scrolling vertically. So I would say the mobile decision was last minute. It kind of is created out of the desktop version instead of on its own or as an individual visualization, and I think that that's not the best approach, but it came out of kind of a necessity for a mobile version in little time.
Absolutely. So just closing off with a discussion about the production. So you spoke before about some of the technologies that you might have used for this. Can you just kind of run through the technologies that you did use for the piece that we see at the end?
Sure. So the area charts originally created are D3, and they are live updating, and then I used SVG Crowbar, a Chrome extension, to kind of grab them from the browser instead of actually recreating them. So I just grabbed them, downloaded them as SVGs. I used Adobe Illustrator to pop everything together, and then I used Photoshop for the photos, and I put it all in Illustrator, and I exported it as an image, put it on WordPress.
Absolutely. And so kind of reflecting on the project, I mean, I know at the time it was tremendously well received amongst the Viz community and also the football world that I have a second existence in terms of listening and watching. How do you reflect on this piece? How do you now look back? Are there things that you'd do differently? Still knowing the circumstances you were working to, that said.
I think I am really proud of this piece. I think that it was one of the, I think it was actually my first solo byline at 538. So obviously 538 with a small newsroom and a small graphics team, there's a lot of collaborations, and even this obviously was a collaboration, but I was really proud of this because I think it was the first byline I had with just my name on it, and I had input from everybody, but it was a really exciting kind of, hey, I had this kind of visual idea and it went through and now it's on the internet and people like it. So I'm extremely proud of the way that it looks. I think that, again, I would do something different for mobile, but I don't know. I don't know what I would do for mobile. I've thought about it a lot and I still stand by my decision. I think the one other thing is the third place match. I'm not so sure how I feel about that. The amount of weight it's given visually, it stands at the same size basically as the final match. I think that I was really rooting for Belgium at the time, so I think that maybe that influenced some of that. I know, I'm sorry, but I love it. I think that it was exciting to see it resonate with people. I think it was one of the graphics that got a lot of traction on Twitter, which I hadn't really experienced before. I think most of my pieces kind of, lived on in other ways, but this was cool to see so many people repost it and kind of talk about it. I'm really proud of it. I think it's really cute.
Absolutely, you should absolutely be as well. Just as a final thing, do you have a favourite match in terms of the shape and the story?
I think the Belgium-Japan one.
I was going to say the same. Yeah.
It's just and I mean, that whole corner is my favorite corner in general because, again,
Neymar.
The Neymar. And also the way that Brazil just feeds into Belgium and then gets kind of shut down. That one is just, it really brings your eye down and then straight to Neymar. And then I think that's my favorite kind of little piece. I also really like Sweden and England when they come together, and Sweden is just that little corner and it's just like trying to drag into, and then it doesn't. So I like those two moments.
Yeah, I think the metaphors you kind of explained there of sort of pushing out off the chart is again kind of what enriches this whole notion of it telling a story of a match, which is hard to do and everyone's trying to do it, and I think this works superbly well. So thank you so much, Rachel. We've had a wonderful chat there about the background to this story. Thank you to everyone out there for tuning in. See you next time on Explore Explain.
To see more information about today's episode, including links to the key sites and resources mentioned, visit my website at visualizingdata.com. You'll also find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time. Explore Explain is a MacNotes interactive production.